Across vast American landscapes, silent monuments of earth and stone hold patterns that refuse simple explanation. Precision-shaped mounds, engraved symbols, and structures aligned with celestial rhythms suggest a depth of planning that still challenges modern understanding. Each fragment raises new uncertainty. What knowledge guided their creation, and why was it preserved in such form? The closer we study them, the more questions emerge. So sit back, relax, and let's step into these enduring mysteries together. As dawn spreads across the sandstone mesas of northern Arizona, long shadows stretch over cliffs sculpted by wind and time. Hidden beneath these towering formations are narrow caves, winding passageways, and ancient alcoves that have sheltered human communities for centuries. The landscape feels almost timeless, where silence is broken only by the breeze moving through the canyons. For the Hopi people, these mesas are far more than dramatic scenery. They are sacred places where history, tradition, and spiritual memory remain deeply rooted in the land. Among the many traditions preserved through Hopi oral history, few have inspired as much curiosity as the account of the Ant people. Passed down through generations, the story tells of a time when humanity faced overwhelming catastrophe. As the world above became dangerous, compassionate beings known as the Ant people offered refuge beneath the earth. Within vast underground chambers, they are said to have protected people, shared food, and helped them survive until it was safe to return to the surface. Anthropologists generally view this narrative as a sacred teaching rather than a literal historical record. Like many indigenous traditions, it carries layers of meaning, expressing values such as cooperation, humility, and harmony with nature. Ants themselves provide a powerful symbol. They work collectively, prepare for hardship, and build intricate underground homes capable of protecting entire colonies from harsh conditions. In this interpretation, the Ant people represent wisdom, resilience, and the importance of community during times of crisis. Yet the story has also encouraged broader questions. Archaeological research confirms that caves and rock shelters played an important role throughout the American Southwest. Ancient communities often used these natural spaces for protection, food storage, ceremonies, and seasonal living. The region is filled with evidence of remarkable engineering, including cliff dwellings carefully constructed within canyon walls. Could memories of seeking shelter underground during periods of environmental hardship have gradually become woven into sacred tradition? Scientists know that North America experienced dramatic climate shifts over thousands of years. Extended droughts, changing rainfall patterns, and other environmental challenges forced many communities to adapt in creative ways. Oral traditions can preserve echoes of real events across countless generations, even as symbolic elements become intertwined with historical memory. If so, does the legend preserve a distant recollection of survival during an ancient crisis? Some researchers have explored more speculative possibilities. A few suggest that the Ant people may represent an unknown culture with sophisticated underground settlements. Others point to stories from different parts of the world that describe mysterious beings emerging from beneath the earth, wondering whether these recurring themes reflect shared human experiences or something less easily explained. Such ideas remain outside mainstream archaeology, supported more by interpretation than by physical evidence. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the Ant people physically existed, but why this tradition has endured with such remarkable strength. What experience inspired a story so deeply connected to protection beneath the earth? Was it symbolic wisdom, cultural memory shaped by real events, or a chapter of human experience that has yet to be fully understood? As the desert wind continues to move through these ancient mesas, the silence seems to guard its own answers, leaving the legend open to thoughtful curiosity rather than certainty. If the stories of the Ant people invite us to look beneath the earth for hidden meaning, the next mystery encourages us to lift our eyes toward the night sky. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, another remarkable landscape raises questions that have lingered for generations. Here, among wide sandstone plains and sweeping horizons, the ruins of Chaco Canyon stand in quiet defiance of time, their massive stone walls still catching the first and last light of the day. At the heart of the canyon lies an extraordinary collection of great houses, ceremonial structures, and carefully engineered roads built by the ancestral Puebloan people between approximately AD 850 and 1150. Even after centuries of weather and abandonment, sites such as Pueblo Bonito continue to astonish archaeologists with their scale and precision. Hundreds of rooms, multi-story construction, and sophisticated masonry reveal a society capable of remarkable planning and organization. Yet beyond the architecture itself, another question slowly emerges. Why do so many structures appear to align so carefully with the movements of the heavens? Researchers have long documented that several buildings in Chaco Canyon correspond with the positions of the rising and setting sun during the summer and winter solstices. Certain doorways, windows, and walls seem deliberately positioned to mark important moments in the yearly cycle. Lunar observations appear to have been significant as well. One of the most discussed examples is the phenomenon known as the sun dagger at nearby Fajada Butte, where shafts of sunlight and shadow interact with ancient spiral petroglyphs during key solar events. Although access to the site is now restricted to preserve it, decades of research have demonstrated that the alignments are genuine. These discoveries have led many archaeologists to conclude that Chaco Canyon functioned not only as a ceremonial center, but also as a place where astronomy, agriculture, and spirituality were closely connected. By carefully observing celestial cycles, communities could anticipate seasonal changes, organize ceremonies, and strengthen social traditions tied to the rhythms of the natural world. But some observers believe the story may reach even further. Looking from above, the network of roads extending outward from Chaco Canyon appears unusually straight, often continuing for miles regardless of difficult terrain. Some seem to lead toward distant landmarks, while others appear to stop abruptly in open country. Why invest such immense effort into constructing routes that do not always seem practical for everyday travel? This question has inspired a more speculative interpretation. A number of independent researchers have proposed that portions of Chaco's layout may mirror prominent stars or constellations visible in the night sky. According to these ideas, the canyon itself may have served as a vast terrestrial reflection of celestial patterns, transforming the surrounding landscape into a sacred map connecting Earth and the heavens. Mainstream archaeology remains cautious. While astronomical alignments are well documented, direct evidence supporting a complete star map has not been found. Human beings naturally recognize patterns, and some apparent correspondences may simply be coincidental rather than intentional. Even so, the possibility continues to inspire debate because astronomy clearly played an important role within Chacoan society. Standing in the canyon after sunset, far from modern city lights, it becomes easier to appreciate why the sky commanded such careful attention. Thousands of stars emerge with astonishing clarity, stretching from one horizon to the other in a brilliant river of light. For the people who gathered here centuries ago, these celestial movements were not distant curiosities, but an essential part of daily life, ceremony, and understanding the world. Perhaps that is the enduring mystery of Chaco Canyon. Were its builders simply exceptional observers of the heavens, recording predictable cycles with extraordinary precision? Or did they encode a deeper cosmological vision into stone, one that modern researchers are only beginning to recognize? For now, the canyon keeps its silence, while the stars continue tracing the same ancient paths overhead, waiting for anyone willing to look a little longer. If Chaco Canyon reminds us that ancient landscapes can preserve knowledge written in stone and aligned with the heavens, our next destination reveals how the earth itself can guard stories that are far more difficult to interpret. Several hundred miles to the west, beyond rugged mountain ranges and the dry basins of the Great Basin Desert, a remote cave became the center of one of the most debated discoveries in Native American history. Known today as Lovelock Cave in northern Nevada, the site rests above what was once the edge of an ancient marsh connected to prehistoric Lake Lahontan. From the outside, the cave appears modest, a shallow opening in a rocky hillside overlooking an otherwise quiet landscape. Yet beneath layers of dust and sediment, archaeologists uncovered evidence that people had occupied or visited the cave for thousands of years. Among woven baskets, duck decoys crafted from tule reeds, tools, and fragments of daily life were human remains that transformed the site into a lasting archaeological mystery. Early excavations in the early 20th century revealed dozens of skeletons, along with artifacts remarkably well preserved by the cave's dry environment. Scientific studies confirmed that indigenous communities, including the ancestors of the northern Paiute, had long used the region. Radiocarbon dating of materials from the cave suggested human activity extending back several thousand years, making it one of the most significant archaeological sites in the Great Basin. The discoveries alone were remarkable, but it was the stories surrounding them that captured the public imagination. Northern Paiute oral tradition speaks of a group called the Si-Te-Ka, often described as hostile outsiders who are said to have lived in the region before being defeated after a prolonged conflict. According to accounts shared through generations, the surviving Si-Te-Ka sought refuge inside a cave. Rather than surrender, they were trapped within, and the entrance was set ablaze, bringing the conflict to a dramatic end. When archaeologists later uncovered human remains inside Lovelock Cave, many immediately connected the discovery with this long-standing tradition. Could the cave described in oral history and the cave excavated by scientists be one and the same? The question remains far from settled. Adding to the mystery were early newspaper reports claiming that some skeletons were exceptionally tall, with a few articles suggesting heights well beyond what would normally be expected. Over time, these reports grew more dramatic. Popular books and magazines began describing a race of red-haired giants who had once inhabited the Great Basin, transforming a local oral tradition into one of North America's most enduring legends. Modern researchers urge caution. Hair can change color after long periods of burial, often appearing reddish because dark pigments gradually break down over time. Likewise, many of the extraordinary claims about enormous skeletons were never supported by careful scientific measurements, and several accounts appear to have grown through repetition rather than documented evidence. No verified archaeological study has confirmed the existence of a population of giant humans at Lovelock Cave. Even so, the persistence of the legend continues to raise thoughtful questions. Oral traditions often preserve memories of genuine conflicts, migrations, or encounters between different groups, even when symbolic details become intertwined with historical events. Could the story of the Si-Te-Ka reflect a distant cultural memory shaped by centuries of retelling? Or does the cave preserve evidence of events that archaeology has not yet fully reconstructed? Today, Lovelock Cave remains an important archaeological site and a place of cultural significance. Its artifacts offer valuable insight into the lives of ancient peoples who adapted to an ever-changing landscape, while its stories remind us that not every mystery can be measured with excavation alone. Standing before the quiet entrance, it is difficult not to wonder whether the greatest secrets were ever hidden beneath the cave floor, or whether they have always survived most faithfully in the memories passed carefully from one generation to the next. Beyond the silent stone of Lovelock Cave, where memory and interpretation continue to overlap, the narrative shifts once again, this time upward, into open skies that seem to stretch without end. Across the vast expanse of the Great Plains, where grasslands ripple like water beneath the wind, stories have long been told of something that moves far above human reach, yet feels deeply present in cultural memory. For many indigenous nations of the plains, the sky is not empty. It is alive with meaning, inhabited by forces that shape weather, guidance, and spiritual understanding. Among the most enduring figures within these traditions is the Thunderbird, a powerful being often described as immense, winged, and capable of producing thunder with the beating of its wings and lightning with the blink of its eyes. In oral traditions passed down through generations, the Thunderbird is not merely a creature, but a force of nature itself. It appears in ceremonies, songs, and artistic depictions carved into stone or painted onto hides. For communities such as the Lakota, Ojibwe, and other plains peoples, it represents protection, transformation, and the balance between natural forces. Its presence in storytelling is well documented, reflecting a worldview in which the physical and spiritual landscapes are deeply intertwined. Yet alongside its symbolic importance, there exist accounts that venture into more uncertain territory. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers, explorers, and local inhabitants across various regions of the American frontier recorded unusual sightings in the sky. Some described enormous bird-like shapes with wingspans far exceeding those of any known species. Others spoke of shadows crossing the sun without warning, accompanied by sudden shifts in wind and weather. These reports, scattered and inconsistent, were often dismissed as misidentifications, exaggerations, or the result of unfamiliarity with natural phenomena such as large raptors or atmospheric conditions. Modern science offers grounded explanations. The Great Plains are home to powerful storms, optical illusions created by heat currents, and migratory birds like eagles and condors that can appear larger under certain lighting conditions. In rare atmospheric events, light and cloud formations can distort perception, creating impressions that feel extraordinary in the moment. From this perspective, many Thunderbird sightings may reflect the meeting point between environment, perception, and storytelling. Still, some accounts resist easy categorization. Certain reports describe behavior that does not align neatly with known wildlife, descriptions of sustained flight at unusual altitudes, or shapes observed against storm fronts that seemed too large or too coordinated to belong to natural birds. While no physical evidence has ever confirmed the existence of a biological Thunderbird, these narratives continue to circulate in local folklore and modern retellings, often carrying a tone of quiet certainty rather than speculation. Archaeological evidence adds another layer of context. Rock art sites across the plains frequently depict large winged figures, sometimes positioned near symbols associated with storms or celestial events. These images are generally interpreted by scholars as spiritual or metaphorical representations rather than literal depictions of physical creatures. Yet they also demonstrate how deeply the concept of a sky being was embedded in cultural understanding, long before written records existed. Could these stories have originated entirely from symbolism, later shaped by natural misinterpretation? Or do they preserve echoes of rare events that were experienced once and carried forward through oral tradition? The absence of definitive evidence leaves the question suspended, neither confirmed nor resolved. As dusk settles over the plains, the horizon often becomes a stage for shifting light and distant storm systems, where thunder rolls across open land long before rain arrives. In such moments, it is easy to understand how a culture might imagine something vast moving above the clouds, watching, responding, perhaps even guiding. And yet the question remains open. Were the Thunderbird sightings born solely from spiritual interpretation and environmental perception, or do they point toward experiences that modern understanding has yet to fully account for? For now, the skies above the Great Plains keep their silence, holding their answers just beyond reach. As the echoes of thunder fade over the Great Plains, the narrative shifts northward, where the landscape hardens into stone and forest, and the air carries a colder silence. Along the rugged shorelines of Lake Superior, the world feels older in a different way, shaped by glaciers, carved by ice, and scattered with exposed bedrock that seems almost deliberately broken open by time itself. Here, among dense pine forests and iron-stained cliffs, the ground holds a different kind of mystery. For centuries, indigenous peoples of the region, including Anishinaabe communities, lived in close relationship with this land and water. Archaeological evidence confirms that these cultures were skilled hunters, fishers, and traders, moving along vast networks of waterways that connected distant regions of North America. But beneath the forest floor and rocky outcrops lies something that has long captured the attention of historians and archaeologists alike. Traces of ancient copper extraction unlike anything expected for its time. Scattered across the Lake Superior Basin are thousands of pits, hammerstones, and worked copper fragments, some of which have been dated to several thousand years ago. The copper found here is unusually pure, often requiring little refining before being shaped into tools, ornaments, and trade objects. What makes the region especially remarkable is not just the presence of copper, but the scale of early activity associated with it. Mainstream archaeological research suggests that indigenous communities engaged in small-scale mining, carefully extracting native copper from exposed deposits along cliffs and shallow pits. Stone hammers and fire-setting techniques appear to have been used to loosen ore from bedrock. Over time, these materials were shaped and traded across vast distances, with copper artifacts discovered as far as the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Yet the distribution of mining sites raises subtle questions. Some of the pits are unusually deep or extensive for what is typically expected from pre-industrial extraction methods. Others appear in locations that would have required significant effort to access, far from easily visible surface deposits. How did early communities identify and locate these sources with such apparent consistency? And why does the scale of extraction in certain areas seem to suggest long-term, organized activity spanning generations? One interpretation is straightforward. The Lake Superior region is geologically rich in native copper that can be found near the surface in certain formations. Over centuries, repeated visits by skilled groups would naturally expand the reach of extraction sites, gradually creating the extensive patterns observed today. In this view, what appears unusual is the result of sustained human activity across a very long timeline. But alternative interpretations have occasionally emerged outside mainstream scholarship. Some writers and independent researchers have suggested that the scale of mining activity might point to a more complex level of early industrial organization than is currently understood. Others have proposed that certain sites show signs of systematic planning that predates what is typically attributed to pre-Columbian cultures in the region. These ideas remain speculative and are not supported by conclusive archaeological evidence, yet they continue to circulate in discussions surrounding the mystery of North American copper use. Adding another layer of intrigue are the so-called copper culture artifacts, tools, ceremonial objects, and trade items that demonstrate advanced metalworking skills. While metallurgy in this context is generally understood as cold hammering native copper rather than smelting, the sophistication of some artifacts still raises thoughtful questions about knowledge transmission and technological development over long periods of time. How did knowledge of copper working spread so widely across distant regions? Were these techniques independently discovered in multiple places, or shared through vast and interconnected trade networks that are only partially understood today? And why does the Lake Superior Basin remain such a concentrated center of early copper activity compared to surrounding regions? Standing along the cold shoreline today, where waves of Lake Superior strike against ancient rock, it is difficult not to imagine the generations who once worked these deposits under very different conditions. Their tools are silent now, their movements preserved only in marks left in stone and soil. Yet the deeper question lingers beneath the surface like the copper itself. Are these mining sites simply the result of gradual, well-documented human activity over millennia? Or do they hint at organizational or technological patterns that modern interpretation has not yet fully mapped? As the narrative moves away from the copper-rich shores of Lake Superior, the journey follows the long, winding path of the Mississippi River, southward, where limestone bluffs rise abruptly from the water and the landscape begins to shift into softer, slower contours. Along a stretch near present-day Alton, Illinois, the cliffs tower above the river like natural watchtowers, shaped by centuries of wind, rain, and flowing current. It is here, etched into memory as much as into stone, that one of the region's most enduring mysteries first came into recorded history. In 1673, French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet documented a striking image painted high on a cliff face overlooking the river. According to their accounts, it depicted a large, bird-like figure with fearsome features, horns, wings spread wide, and a body that seemed to combine elements of multiple creatures. The explorers were reportedly struck by its presence, describing it as something that inspired both awe and unease as they passed beneath it in their canoes. That original painting no longer survives in its earliest form. Weather, erosion, and time have gradually worn away the cliff face, but later reconstructions and historical sketches preserve interpretations of what early observers believed they saw. Today, a modern reproduction of the image has been recreated on the limestone bluffs, standing as a visual reminder of a figure known as the Piasa bird. Local indigenous traditions associated with the region offer different perspectives on its meaning. Some accounts describe it as a powerful spirit creature, sometimes linked to danger, transformation, or forces within nature that demand respect. Like many figures in indigenous storytelling, its meaning is not fixed in a single definition, but exists within a broader cultural and spiritual framework. Early European settlers, encountering the image without its cultural context, often interpreted it through the lens of folklore and mythology. Over time, descriptions of the Piasa bird evolved, blending indigenous oral traditions with imaginative retellings. By the 19th century, it was frequently described in dramatic terms as a monstrous predator that once terrorized the riverbanks, a narrative that has since been widely questioned by historians. Modern scholarship tends to view the original cliff painting as a symbolic or ceremonial image, rather than a literal depiction of a physical creature. Indigenous rock art across North America often represents spiritual beings, clan symbols, or cosmological ideas, rather than biological entities. From this perspective, the Piasa bird may have been part of a larger visual language used to communicate beliefs, stories, or territorial significance. Yet the exact origins of the image remain uncertain. No definitive archaeological record confirms precisely when it was created, who painted it, or what specific meaning it held for its original makers. The earliest written descriptions come from European observers, long after the original cultural context had already begun to fade from view. This gap in understanding leaves space for interpretation, speculation, and continued curiosity. Some independent researchers have suggested that repeated descriptions of large, hybrid creatures in indigenous oral traditions might point toward shared mythological themes across regions, possibly reflecting symbolic representations of storms, predators, or natural forces. Others have speculated, far beyond mainstream acceptance, that such images could preserve memories of encounters with unknown or misunderstood animals, though no physical evidence supports this idea in the case of the Piasa bird. Standing before the reconstructed image today, overlooking the steady movement of the Mississippi, it is difficult not to consider how many meanings may have once been layered into its original form. Was it meant as a warning, a story of spiritual power, a marker of territory, or something more complex that modern interpretation can only partially recover? The river continues its passage as it always has, carrying sediment, stories, and silence downstream. And above its cliffs, the Piasa bird remains suspended between history and interpretation, its true origin still resting somewhere between what was recorded, what was remembered, and what has yet to be fully understood. As the Mississippi's waters continue their quiet descent toward distant deltas, the narrative turns once more into the high, dry country of the American Southwest. Here, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the air carries the sharp clarity of altitude and stone, the land holds another kind of enigma, one shaped not by rivers or cliffs, but by Earth itself. Within the canyon systems of what is now New Mexico and Arizona, the ancestral Puebloans built some of the most complex pre-contact settlements in North America. Sites such as Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and surrounding regions reveal architectural achievements that continue to draw careful study. Massive stone structures rise in organized clusters, their walls constructed with remarkable precision, aligned with environmental conditions, seasonal patterns, and long-term habitation needs. At first glance, these settlements appear as monumental villages, multi-story buildings, ceremonial spaces, storage rooms, and interconnected plazas carved into a harsh landscape. Yet, when viewed through the lens of modern interpretation, they sometimes evoke a more layered question. How far did their architectural planning extend? And how did these communities organize life across such vast and challenging terrain? Archaeological research provides grounded explanations. The so-called Great Houses of Chaco Canyon, for example, are understood as centers of social, ceremonial, and administrative activity rather than isolated dwellings. Evidence shows that communities across the region were connected by an extensive network of roads and trade routes, linking smaller settlements to larger cultural hubs. Seasonal migration, resource distribution, and ritual gatherings all played roles in shaping how these spaces were used. In some locations, particularly in cliff dwellings like those found at Mesa Verde, structures appear to be integrated into natural alcoves within canyon walls. These were carefully constructed living spaces designed for protection, storage, and community life. The impression they create today, homes suspended in stone, has led to modern descriptions that sometimes refer to them as underground cities, though they are more accurately understood as cliffside or canyon-built settlements. Still, the way these environments were organized continues to raise thoughtful questions. Why were some communities concentrated in dense architectural clusters, while others remained more dispersed? What prompted gradual movement from open settlements into more sheltered canyon environments during certain periods? Archaeological evidence suggests that environmental shifts, including prolonged drought cycles and resource pressures between approximately AD 900 and 1300, influenced settlement patterns. Yet the full complexity of these transitions remains an active subject of study. Beyond mainstream interpretation, alternative theories occasionally emerge. Some independent researchers propose that certain architectural layouts may reflect more centralized planning than currently understood, suggesting coordination across wider regions than traditional models assume. Others have speculated about whether some structures served not only practical and ceremonial roles, but also symbolic or astronomical purposes integrated into daily life. These ideas, while intriguing, remain outside established archaeological consensus and are not supported by definitive evidence. What remains undeniable is the sophistication of construction itself. The precision of masonry, the alignment of key structures, and the scale of regional connectivity point to societies capable of long-term planning and cultural continuity over centuries. Yet even with extensive excavation and study, not every function of these spaces is fully understood. Some rooms show signs of limited use, others appear repurposed over time, and certain architectural choices still resist simple explanation. Walking among these ruins today, there is a sense that the landscape still holds layers of meaning not immediately visible. Stone walls that once supported daily life now stand in silence, shaped by wind and light rather than human movement. The question becomes less about what these places were, and more about how their original purpose may have shifted over time within living memory. And so the uncertainty remains. Were these architectural complexes simply highly organized settlements adapted to environmental pressures and cultural needs, or do they represent a level of regional coordination and symbolic design that modern interpretation has only partially reconstructed? For now, the stone cities of the ancestral Puebloans remain suspended between clarity and mystery, waiting, like much of the past, for the next layer of understanding to emerge from what is still hidden beneath the surface. As the silence settles over the stone-built landscapes of the ancestral Puebloans, the narrative moves from physical architecture to something far less tangible, yet deeply embedded within the same cultural world. In the high desert mesas of what is now northern Arizona, where wind moves through sandstone corridors and sunlight cuts sharply across pale rock, another layer of understanding emerges, one that cannot be measured in stone or mapped in roads. Within Hopi tradition, the Kachina spirits occupy this threshold between the visible world and the unseen. They are not distant abstractions, but active presences within cultural teachings, ceremonial life, and seasonal cycles. Representing aspects of nature, ancestral guidance, and spiritual balance, Kachinas are understood as intermediaries who help maintain harmony between human communities and the broader forces of the natural world. In ceremonial practice, Kachina figures are embodied through masked dancers and carved wooden dolls known as tithu, which are given to children as educational tools. These objects are not worshipped in a literal sense, but serve as symbolic representations that carry teachings about responsibility, environment, and community values. The Hopi calendar itself is structured around ceremonial periods, in which these spiritual narratives are enacted through dance, song, and ritual observance. Anthropological studies generally interpret Kachina traditions as complex systems of cultural knowledge, ways of encoding environmental understanding, moral instruction, and social cohesion. The spirits associated with rain, corn, animals, and celestial phenomena reflect a worldview in which human survival is deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. In this interpretation, the Kachinas function as symbolic frameworks that preserve ecological awareness across generations. Yet, like many indigenous spiritual systems, their meaning extends beyond a single interpretive layer. The origin of Kachina traditions is not precisely defined in historical records. They emerge from oral histories that extend far beyond written documentation, making it difficult to trace their earliest development in a conventional timeline. Some researchers suggest that these traditions may preserve ancient ecological knowledge, encoded through metaphor and ritual, passed down through centuries of lived experience in the harsh but carefully understood environment of the Southwest. Others have noted the remarkable consistency of Kachina imagery across time, suggesting a system of belief that has remained stable despite environmental and social changes over many generations. How did such a detailed ceremonial structure develop and persist in relatively isolated desert communities? And what mechanisms allowed this knowledge to remain so carefully preserved without written language? In more speculative discussions, a few independent interpretations have proposed that Kachina narratives could represent encounters with natural phenomena that were later personified into spiritual beings. Others have gone further, suggesting that recurring descriptions of sky messengers, masked figures, or seasonal visitors might reflect deeper symbolic attempts to explain unexplained environmental patterns. These interpretations, however, remain outside mainstream anthropology and are not supported by physical evidence. What remains consistently emphasized by Hopi cultural perspectives is that Kachinas are not myths in the dismissive sense often used in external analysis. They are part of an active, living tradition that continues to guide ceremonial life and cultural identity. Their meaning is not confined to historical curiosity, but remains embedded in ongoing practice, where knowledge is passed through participation rather than detached observation. Standing within the quiet mesas where these ceremonies take place, the boundary between the material and the symbolic becomes less distinct. The land itself seems to participate in the narrative, shaped by wind, rain, and seasonal change, echoing the very forces the Kachinas are said to represent. And so the question lingers, not as a demand for explanation, but as an invitation to reflection. Are the Kachinas best understood as symbolic expressions of environmental understanding, as preserved memory of ancient observation, or as something that exists within a cultural framework not meant to be fully translated into external terms? For now, they remain where they have always been, within ceremony, within story, and within the quiet space between what is seen and what is understood. As the presence of the Kachina spirits lingers within the quiet rhythm of ceremonial memory, the narrative turns once more to the foundations beneath it all, both literal and symbolic. In the high mesas of northern Arizona, where stone villages cling to the edges of cliffs and the desert wind moves through narrow passageways, there exists a concept that sits at the very center of Hopi cosmology, the Sipapu. Within Hopi tradition, the Sipapu is described as a sacred emergence point, a symbolic opening through which the earliest beings are said to have entered this world from a previous one. It is often represented as a small hole or marking in ceremonial spaces, most commonly within kivas, subterranean chambers used for ritual, gathering, and spiritual instruction. These kivas, partially built underground, create a sense of descent, as if moving closer to the earth itself is also a movement toward origin and memory. Archaeological studies confirm that kivas were central to ancestral Puebloan life. These carefully constructed circular rooms, often entered through a roof opening, were used for ceremonies, decision-making, and communal gatherings. A small floor opening, sometimes interpreted as symbolic, is frequently identified as the Sipapu marker. From a material perspective, it is understood as a ritual feature, a physical representation of cultural narratives tied to emergence and continuity. Yet within Hopi belief, the Sipapu carries a meaning that extends beyond architecture. It is not simply a design element, but a point of connection between worlds, between what was, what is, and what is remembered. It represents transition, transformation, and the journey of life itself. In this sense, it is both place and idea, grounded in physical space while pointing toward something less easily defined. Anthropologists generally interpret the Sipapu as part of a broader mythological framework that encodes origin stories, migration histories, and spiritual teachings. According to these interpretations, the emergence narratives preserved in Hopi tradition reflect deeply rooted cultural memory, expressed through symbolic geography rather than literal geography. The descent into kivas and the presence of the Sipapu marker reinforce the idea of returning to origins as part of ceremonial reflection. Still, the concept raises questions that invite further contemplation. Why does so many indigenous architectural traditions incorporate symbolic thresholds between levels of space? Why does the act of moving downward, into earth, into chamber, into enclosed space, so often appear connected to ideas of origin, protection, or transformation? Across different cultures worldwide, subterranean chambers frequently carry ritual significance. Whether this reflects shared psychological symbolism, environmental adaptation, or deeper cultural continuity is a question that continues to be explored. Some speculative interpretations have gone further, suggesting that emergence narratives like the Sipapu may preserve distant memories of geological events, migrations, or environmental transitions encoded in symbolic form. Others propose that such concepts reflect universal human perceptions of descent and rebirth, expressed through architecture and ceremony. These ideas remain outside established archaeological conclusions, yet they continue to appear in discussions surrounding ancient symbolic systems. What remains consistent across interpretations is the importance of the Sipapu as a marker of connection. It anchors ceremony, story, and space together in a way that resists simple classification. It is neither solely myth nor solely structure, but something that exists in the intersection between cultural meaning and physical design. Standing within a kiva today, the air cool and still, the sense of descent is immediate. Light filters in from above, tracing the edge of the opening that marks this symbolic passage. One can see how space itself becomes part of storytelling, how architecture is not only built to shelter, but to remind. And so the question remains, quietly unresolved. Is the Sipapu best understood as a symbolic representation of origin, a preserved cultural memory encoded in architecture, or a reflection of experiences so ancient that they now survive only in ritual form? For now, it remains exactly where it has always been, at the boundary between earth and meaning, between descent and emergence, between what is known and what is still waiting to be understood. As the descent into the Sipapu fades into the quiet symbolism of emergence and origin, the narrative lifts once again, this time away from the earth and into the vast, unbroken expanse above it. Across the northern plains, where the horizon seems to curve endlessly and the night sky opens like a boundless dome, another tradition takes shape in the language of stars. For the Lakota people, the sky is not distant or detached. It is a living extension of existence itself, filled with relatives, teachings, and guiding presences. Among these teachings is the concept often translated as the star ancestors, beings understood as part of a spiritual kinship that connects human life to the cosmos. In Lakota worldview, the stars are not inert objects, but relatives who participate in the unfolding order of the universe. Oral histories describe the sky as a place of origin and return, where the spirits of ancestors and guiding forces exist in relationship with the living world. Certain constellations carry meaning tied to seasonal cycles, ceremonial timing, and moral teachings. The night sky becomes, in this sense, a map not only of movement, but of memory and responsibility. Anthropological studies generally interpret these traditions as part of a sophisticated astronomical awareness embedded within spiritual understanding. The Lakota, like many plains cultures, observed celestial patterns closely, aligning ceremonies and seasonal activities with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. This knowledge was not recorded in written charts, but preserved through storytelling, ritual, and lived observation across generations. Yet the idea of star ancestors carries a dimension that extends beyond practical astronomy. In Lakota teachings, these beings are sometimes described as guiding presences who influenced the emergence of knowledge, offering direction during times of transition or uncertainty. They are not typically described in physical terms in the modern sense, but as part of a relational cosmos in which all existence is interconnected. The boundary between metaphor, memory, and spiritual reality is not clearly separated, but woven together in a continuous understanding of the world. This layered perspective has drawn attention from researchers attempting to understand how oral traditions preserve complex knowledge systems. How did communities without written records maintain such detailed awareness of celestial cycles over long periods of time? And how did symbolic storytelling encode information that remained consistent across generations? Mainstream interpretations suggest that careful long-term observation, combined with ritual reinforcement, allowed astronomical knowledge to be preserved with remarkable accuracy. Ceremonial structures, Seasonal gatherings, and narrative repetition all contributed to maintaining this continuity. In this view, the star ancestors represent a spiritual framework that supported practical understanding of the sky. At the same time, more speculative interpretations occasionally emerge outside academic discourse. Some independent writers suggest that recurring themes of sky relatives and celestial guidance across different cultures might reflect shared human attempts to interpret rare astronomical events or atmospheric phenomena. Others propose broader symbolic theories about human perception of the cosmos as a relational system rather than an impersonal space. These interpretations remain unverified and sit outside established historical and anthropological consensus, yet they continue to appear in discussions of ancient sky traditions. What remains clear is the central role of the stars in shaping Lakota understanding of time, identity, and relationship. The night sky is not simply observed. It is engaged with, remembered, and spoken of as part of a living system that includes both visible and invisible dimensions of existence. Standing beneath the vast plain sky today, where constellations emerge with striking clarity, it is easy to understand why such a worldview would take shape. The stars feel close, yet unreachable, familiar, yet infinite. They suggest order, but also mystery. They mark time, yet seem untouched by it. And so the question remains, suspended like light across the dark. Are the star ancestors best understood as symbolic expressions of cosmic relationship, as preserved astronomical knowledge encoded in spiritual language, or as something that continues to exist within a framework of understanding not fully captured by modern interpretation? For now, the sky offers no answer, only its endless presence, watching quietly above the world below. As the vision of the star ancestors fades into the quiet geometry of the night sky, the narrative begins to drift westward once again, away from the open plains and toward the edge of the continent, where land and ocean meet in a constant exchange of mist, tide, and stone. Here, along the rugged coastline of the Pacific Northwest, the world feels less like a boundary and more like a threshold. Towering cedar forests rise from steep shorelines, their roots gripping cliffs that drop into cold, shifting waters. Fog moves through these landscapes with deliberate patience, sometimes obscuring entire islands for hours, even days. To modern eyes, this region is already remote, already difficult to fully map in detail. But within indigenous oral traditions of the Haida people, it is also a place shaped by deeper time, where land itself is remembered as something that has changed, retreated, and reappeared. Among these traditions exists a concept sometimes referred to in modern retellings as the lost island of the Haida ancestors. It is not a single, clearly defined location on any contemporary map, but rather a convergence of memory, oral history, and geological transformation tied to the ancient landscapes of Haida Gwaii, an archipelago off the coast of what is now British Columbia, Canada. Archaeological evidence confirms that Haida Gwaii has been continuously inhabited for at least 13,000 years, making it one of the oldest known regions of human settlement in North America. Ancient village sites, stone tools, and cultural remains reveal a long and deeply rooted relationship between the Haida people and this coastal environment. These communities developed sophisticated maritime technologies, including canoes capable of navigating open ocean waters, as well as complex artistic and social systems that remain influential to this day. But beneath this continuity lies a landscape that has not always been stable. During the last ice age and its aftermath, global sea levels were significantly lower. Geological studies show that coastlines extended much farther outward than they do today, meaning that vast areas now submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean were once exposed land. As the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, entire stretches of coastline were gradually reshaped, with some regions disappearing beneath the sea over thousands of years. This shifting geography has led researchers to consider an important possibility: that portions of ancient coastal landscapes associated with early human habitation may now lie underwater, preserved beneath layers of sediment and ocean currents. Archaeologists have identified submerged sites in various parts of the world where evidence of past human activity still exists beneath modern sea levels, though exploration in the North Pacific remains limited by environmental conditions and technological challenges. Within Haida oral traditions, there are accounts that describe changes in the land over time, stories that speak of migrations, transformations, and the deep relationship between people and the sea. Some narratives describe a world in which land and water were more fluid, where islands shifted, or where ancestral journeys followed routes that are no longer visible in the same form today. These accounts are not presented as historical maps in the modern sense, but as layered teachings that connect identity, place, and memory. Mainstream anthropological interpretation understands these traditions as cultural memory shaped by long-term environmental change, preserved through storytelling rather than written record. In this view, references to shifting land or ancestral journeys reflect lived experiences of coastal transformation over thousands of years, encoded in symbolic and narrative forms that emphasize relationship rather than chronology. Yet the idea of a lost island continues to appear in broader discussions of the region, often inspired by both geological evidence and the enduring presence of oral history. Some speculative interpretations suggest that rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age may have submerged entire cultural landscapes, potentially preserving archaeological evidence beneath the Pacific Ocean that has yet to be fully explored. Others propose that oral traditions may retain echoes of these submerged geographies, not as precise maps, but as cultural memory of a world that once extended further into what is now open water. There are also more imaginative theories found outside academic circles, suggesting the possibility of highly advanced coastal settlements that were gradually lost to changing sea levels, leaving only fragments of memory behind. These ideas remain unverified and are not supported by direct archaeological evidence, yet they persist in modern storytelling as part of a broader fascination with submerged histories around the world. What makes the Haida region particularly compelling is not only the possibility of submerged landscapes, but the continuity of cultural presence itself. Unlike many regions where ancient sites are separated from living traditions, Haida Gwaii remains home to an active, enduring culture that maintains deep connections to its ancestral lands and waters. This continuity creates a rare intersection between archaeology, oral tradition, and living memory. Walking along the coastline today, it is not difficult to imagine how profoundly the sea shapes perception of place. The tides arrive and withdraw with rhythmic certainty, revealing and concealing shorelines in a constant cycle. Islands appear and disappear behind layers of mist. The boundary between land and ocean feels less like a fixed line and more like a living process. In such an environment, the idea of a lost island becomes less about disappearance in a single moment and more about gradual transformation over immense spans of time. What once was visible may now lie beneath the waves, not erased, but simply shifted into a different state of presence, one that requires different tools, perspectives, and patience to understand. And so the question remains, open and unresolved, like the horizon itself. Are the stories of the Haida ancestors pointing toward submerged landscapes that archaeology has yet to fully uncover? Or are they preserving something more fluid, memories of a world in motion, where land and sea were never truly separate, but always part of the same unfolding relationship? For now, the Pacific continues its slow rhythm against the coast, holding its depths in silence, as if guarding whatever stories still lie beneath its surface. As the narrative drifts away from the mist-laced coastlines of Haida Gwaii, where ocean and memory seem to blur into one another, the focus shifts once more into the vast interior of the northern lands. Here, where the forests of the subarctic give way to tundra and long stretches of silence, the horizon opens in a different way, less vertical, more infinite. It is a landscape shaped by cold air, long winters, and skies so clear they appear almost closer than they should be. Across this immense northern region, home to the Dene peoples for thousands of years, the sky has always been more than a backdrop. It is part of a living system of understanding, an environment where movement, weather, direction, and spiritual orientation are all read together. The Dene, like many indigenous cultures of the North, developed detailed knowledge of stars, seasonal shifts, and atmospheric patterns, knowledge that guided travel across vast and often unforgiving terrain. In oral traditions and modern interpretations of these teachings, there are references to places sometimes described metaphorically as sky portals, or openings within the heavens. These are not physical structures in the modern architectural sense, but rather conceptual thresholds, points where the sky is understood to be especially close, especially active, or especially significant within cycles of time and movement. To understand why such ideas emerge, it is necessary to look at the environment itself. In the northern latitudes, the sky behaves differently than in more temperate regions. The aurora borealis can sweep across the horizon in shifting curtains of green, violet, and white, sometimes moving so dynamically that the entire sky appears to be in motion. Meteor activity is more visible in dark, unpolluted skies. Seasonal changes in light are extreme, with long periods of darkness followed by equally long periods of daylight. In such conditions, the sky is not a distant abstraction. It is an immediate presence that dominates perception. Within this context, indigenous knowledge systems often describe the sky as layered, animated, and responsive. Among some Dene narratives, certain celestial phenomena are interpreted as moments when the boundary between worlds feels thinner, times when communication between the human and the cosmic becomes more perceptible. These descriptions are deeply rooted in lived experience, observation, and cultural interpretation rather than physical claims about structures in the sky. Anthropological research generally understands these ideas as part of a sophisticated worldview in which astronomy, navigation, and spirituality are interwoven. The Dene and neighboring indigenous nations developed detailed star knowledge systems used for orientation during travel, seasonal planning, and storytelling. Constellations were not simply patterns of light, but relational markers that connected human activity to broader environmental cycles. Yet the phrase sky portals, as it appears in modern retellings, has generated curiosity outside academic contexts. Some interpretations suggest that these descriptions may metaphorically reflect the intense atmospheric phenomena of the North, particularly auroras, which can appear to open, ripple, or reveal movement within the sky. To observers without modern scientific frameworks, such displays could easily be experienced as passages or openings into another realm. In this sense, the portal is not a physical gateway, but a perceptual threshold created by extraordinary natural conditions. Other researchers approach the idea from a different angle, considering whether such descriptions might preserve ancient mnemonic systems, ways of encoding environmental knowledge into symbolic language. In this view, sky portals could represent specific astronomical events, seasonal markers, or navigational cues, remembered through metaphor and ritualized storytelling over generations. There are also more speculative interpretations found in fringe literature, suggesting that widespread indigenous references to sky-based thresholds might point to shared experiences of rare celestial events that were later interpreted through spiritual frameworks. These ideas often attempt to link disparate traditions across continents, but they remain outside established anthropological consensus and are not supported by physical evidence. What remains consistently emphasized by Dene knowledge keepers is that the sky is not separate from life on the ground. It is part of a continuous system of relationships between animals, weather, movement, and human decision-making. The sky is observed not as something to be conquered or decoded, but as something to be lived with, listened to, and respected. Standing in the northern tundra at night, the experience of the sky can feel overwhelming in its scale. The aurora may shift silently above, casting light over snow-covered ground in waves that seem almost intentional in their rhythm. In those moments, it becomes easier to understand how the boundary between observation and meaning might blur. And so the question emerges, not as a claim, but as a reflection. Are the sky portals of the Dene best understood as metaphorical language shaped by extraordinary environmental phenomena, as structured astronomical knowledge encoded in narrative form, or as something that modern frameworks have not yet fully learned how to interpret? For now, the northern sky remains open and unsealed, moving endlessly above the land, as it always has, holding its patterns in silence and light. As the narrative fades from the vast northern skies of the Dene, where auroras ripple like shifting thresholds between worlds, the journey moves south once more into a landscape shaped by silence, stone, and distance. The air grows warmer, the terrain more sculpted, yet no less vast. Here, where the Colorado Plateau stretches across parts of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, the land belongs to long horizons and night skies that feel impossibly close. Within this region lies the Navajo Nation, one of the largest indigenous territories in North America, encompassing deserts, mesas, and canyons carved by time and wind. It is a place where geography itself seems to encourage reflection, where visibility extends for miles, and where darkness at night can feel absolute, broken only by stars, wind, and the occasional distant glow of human settlement. And it is here, within this expansive quiet, that stories of unusual nighttime lights have persisted for generations, often referred to in modern retellings as the floating lights of the Navajo Reservation. These accounts describe luminous phenomena appearing in remote stretches of desert and canyon land. Witnesses have spoken of soft glows drifting above the ground, orbs of light moving without obvious source, and occasional flashes that seem to hover between earth and sky. Some describe them as distant lanterns moving across empty terrain. Others describe them as pulsing spheres that appear suddenly, remain for a time, and then fade without trace. These accounts are not uniform, nor are they confined to a single period. Reports appear across decades, sometimes separated by generations, often emerging independently from different observers who have no connection to one another. This pattern has made the phenomenon difficult to classify in simple terms, and even more difficult to fully explain within a single framework. From a scientific perspective, the region offers several grounded possibilities. The Colorado Plateau is geologically active in subtle but important ways. Mineral deposits beneath the surface can, under certain conditions, produce faint luminescence known as earth lights or piezoelectric effects, where pressure on certain rocks generates small electrical charges. Atmospheric conditions in desert environments can also create optical illusions, especially when temperature gradients bend light over long distances. In rare cases, distant human activity, vehicles, fires, or industrial lights, can appear distorted across vast stretches of terrain, creating the impression of movement or hovering illumination. Ball lightning, though still not fully understood, has also been proposed as a possible explanation for some isolated reports of spherical light phenomena in various parts of the world. While rare and difficult to study directly, it remains one of several natural processes considered in discussions of unexplained atmospheric lights. Yet within Navajo oral tradition and local storytelling, these lights are often described in a different context altogether. Some accounts interpret them as part of a broader spiritual landscape, where the natural world is alive with presence and meaning. In this understanding, light is not merely a physical phenomenon, but also a form of communication or indication, something that may signal movement, presence, or transition within the environment. These interpretations are not presented as scientific claims, but as part of a worldview in which human experience and landscape are deeply interconnected. It is important to note that such descriptions vary widely, and not all accounts assign spiritual meaning to these lights. Some are simply recorded as unusual visual experiences observed in isolation, without interpretation or cultural framing. The diversity of accounts itself becomes part of the mystery. Historical context adds another layer of complexity. The Navajo Nation spans a region with limited artificial lighting in many areas, especially in remote zones far from roads and infrastructure. This creates conditions where even faint sources of light can appear unusually prominent against the darkness of the desert night. The human eye, adapted for pattern recognition, can interpret ambiguous light sources as structured movement, especially in environments where visual reference points are minimal. Yet even with these explanations, certain elements of the phenomenon remain difficult to fully categorize. Some witnesses describe lights that appear to respond to movement, or that maintain consistent shapes over time without apparent source. Others report synchronized motion across distances that seem too great for known natural or human-made causes to explain easily. Somewhere between Earth and horizon, between perception and explanation, the floating lights continue to exist, neither fully defined nor fully dismissed, but suspended in the quiet space where observation becomes mystery, and mystery becomes part of the landscape itself. As the desert lights of the Navajo lands fade into memory, those drifting orbs that seem to hover between explanation and uncertainty, the narrative shifts northward once more. The terrain begins to rise, slowly at first, then with greater force, as the plains give way to rolling forested uplands and ancient rock formations. Here, in the heart of what is now South Dakota and Wyoming, the land gathers itself into something older, denser, and more sculpted. The Black Hills emerge from the surrounding grasslands like an island of stone and forest. Dense pine stands cover steep slopes, granite peaks rise unexpectedly from the earth, and narrow valleys hold rivers that cut through rock worn down over immense spans of time. To modern geography, this region is a geological uplift, an exposed core of ancient mountains. But to the Lakota people and other indigenous nations connected to this land, the Black Hills hold an even deeper significance, a place of origin, ceremony, and enduring spiritual presence. Within this landscape, stories have long been told of unusual fires, lights that appear in remote valleys or high ridges, sometimes flickering where no human settlement exists, sometimes lingering in places far removed from roads, trails, or clear explanation. These are often referred to in oral retellings and modern accounts as spirit fires of the Black Hills. Unlike ordinary campfires, these lights are described as appearing without visible source. Witnesses have spoken of flames that seem to rise and fall in silence, or glows that drift between trees before disappearing entirely. Some accounts describe multiple points of light appearing in sequence along ridgelines, as though responding to something unseen. Others recall single, steady flames observed in areas known to be uninhabited at the time. The Black Hills themselves are a place where perception can be shaped by terrain. Deep valleys can trap light, while granite outcrops reflect moonlight in unexpected ways. Mist often settles in low-lying areas, and temperature shifts between day and night can create atmospheric distortions that affect visibility. In such conditions, distant lightning, firelight, or even reflections from natural sources can appear altered, stretched, or displaced across the landscape. From a scientific standpoint, several grounded explanations have been proposed for reports of unexplained lights in wilderness environments like the Black Hills. These include distant wildfires reflecting through atmospheric layers, bioluminescent phenomena under rare environmental conditions, and optical illusions caused by refraction across uneven terrain. In some cases, what appears as a floating flame may originate from hidden valleys or distant ridges, with elevation and darkness obscuring its true source. Yet within indigenous traditions connected to the region, fire carries meanings that extend beyond physical combustion. In Lakota worldview, fire is often understood as a living presence within ceremonial life, a medium of connection, transformation, and communication. Sacred fires are central to many gatherings and rituals, representing continuity between generations and the presence of spiritual forces within the natural world. Within this framework, references to spirit fires in broader storytelling can be understood as expressions of this relationship between fire, land, and presence. It is important to recognize that these interpretations are not uniform or literal descriptions of physical phenomena, but rather part of a cultural system in which natural elements are understood as relational and symbolic. The Black Hills themselves are not simply geography, but a place where meaning is continuously enacted through story, ceremony, and lived experience. At the same time, reports of unexplained lights in wilderness regions are not unique to this area. Across many parts of the world, similar accounts appear, descriptions of lights that move without visible source, flicker in uninhabited regions, or seem to respond to environmental conditions in ways that defy easy categorization. This broader pattern has led researchers to approach such phenomena with both caution and curiosity. Some independent interpretations suggest that recurring reports of spirit fires in different cultures may reflect shared human responses to rare atmospheric conditions, where natural light sources are interpreted through cultural frameworks shaped by environment and tradition. Others propose that these accounts preserve memory of natural events, such as distant wildfires or electrical atmospheric discharges, that were experienced in conditions where their origins were not immediately visible. These explanations remain speculative in many cases, as direct observation under controlled conditions is often not possible. There are also more interpretive perspectives that focus not on physical explanation, but on how landscapes themselves shape perception. In dense forests and rugged terrain, visibility is limited. Sound travels differently. Light behaves unpredictably as it filters through trees, stone, and mist. In such environments, human perception becomes deeply sensitive to subtle changes, and interpretation can become inseparable from observation. This raises a quieter question. At what point does perception become part of the phenomenon itself? Standing within the Black Hills at dusk, the transition from day to night feels gradual but profound. Shadows lengthen across granite formations. The forest darkens in layers rather than all at once. In some valleys, light lingers longer than expected, caught between ridges and reflected surfaces. It is not difficult to imagine how, in such conditions, a distant flicker might take on meaning far beyond its physical origin. And yet, the accounts persist, not as isolated anecdotes, but as recurring observations across time, sometimes separated by decades, sometimes emerging from different parts of the region without apparent connection. The consistency of these descriptions invites attention, even if their explanation remains uncertain. Are the spirit fires of the Black Hills best understood as natural optical and atmospheric effects interpreted through cultural frameworks shaped by sacred relationship with fire? Or do they point toward rare environmental conditions that science has not yet fully documented in this specific landscape? Or, more subtly, do they reveal something about the way meaning is assigned to light itself when it appears in places where human presence is minimal and silence is absolute? For now, no single interpretation fully settles the question. The Black Hills remain as they have always been, dense with forest, shaped by ancient stone, and marked by a presence that is felt as much as it is seen. And somewhere within that landscape, according to those who have witnessed them, the lights may still appear, brief, uncertain, and unclaimed by any definitive explanation. Whether fire, reflection, atmosphere, or something else entirely, they continue to exist in the space between observation and understanding, where the land is not only seen, but interpreted, and where interpretation itself becomes part of the mystery. As the last echoes of the spirit fires of the Black Hills fade into the darkened forest valleys, the narrative moves once more toward the far reaches of the northern coastline. The terrain shifts dramatically again, away from granite uplifts and pine-covered ridges, toward a world carved by ocean, ice, and relentless tide. Here, along the southeastern coastline of what is now Alaska, the land breaks apart into islands, fjords, and steep cliffs that rise directly from cold, salt-heavy waters. This is the traditional homeland of the Tlingit people, a culture deeply shaped by the rhythms of sea and forest, where cedar trees grow thick along shorelines and mist moves through narrow inlets like a living presence. The environment is both abundant and severe, offering rich resources but demanding careful knowledge of land, water, and seasonal cycles. Within this landscape, memory is not stored in isolation. It is embedded in place itself. Among the many cultural traditions associated with this region are accounts of burial caves, hidden or secluded spaces where the dead were placed with care, ceremony, and profound respect. These sites are not simply physical locations, but part of a broader understanding of death, ancestry, and continuity that reflects Tlingit social and spiritual structure. In traditional Tlingit practice, burial customs varied depending on clan, status, and circumstance. Some individuals were placed in carved wooden boxes elevated in trees or on platforms. Others were interred in communal or clan-associated burial sites, sometimes within natural rock formations or sheltered caves along cliffs. These practices reflected both practical environmental adaptation and deeply held beliefs about the relationship between the living and the spirit world. Over time, some of these burial locations became concealed by natural processes, rockfall, vegetation growth, shifting shorelines, and erosion. In certain cases, the entrances to caves or sheltered spaces may have become partially or fully obscured, leaving behind only oral references or fragmented archaeological traces. This has contributed to modern references to hidden burial caves, a phrase that captures both physical obscurity and cultural sensitivity. Archaeological evidence in the region confirms that coastal cave sites and rock shelters were used by indigenous communities across thousands of years for a variety of purposes, including temporary shelter, ritual activity, and burial. However, the study of such sites is often limited by both environmental conditions and the cultural importance of preserving ancestral remains undisturbed. As a result, many locations remain undocumented in detail or are intentionally protected from public disclosure. From a historical perspective, what is known is that Tlingit mortuary practices are highly structured and deeply symbolic. Burial is not treated as an endpoint, but as part of a continuing relationship between the living and the deceased. Objects placed with the dead, the orientation of burial sites, and the selection of locations all carry meaning within clan identity and spiritual understanding. In this framework, caves and sheltered natural spaces may serve not only as physical resting places, but as transitional environments, spaces where transformation is acknowledged rather than concealed. Yet the idea of hidden caves continues to appear in broader discussions of the region, often shaped by a combination of geography, oral tradition, and incomplete archaeological visibility. The southeastern Alaskan coastline is one of the most complex geological environments in North America. Glacial activity over thousands of years carved deep fjords and created a constantly shifting interface between land and sea. Sea levels have changed over long periods, and coastal erosion continues to reshape cliffs and shorelines. In such a dynamic environment, it is entirely possible that some burial locations once accessible from land are now more difficult to reach, partially submerged, or obscured by dense forest regrowth. This physical reality contributes to the sense that certain spaces remain hidden, not in the sense of deliberate concealment, but through the natural evolution of landscape over time. At the same time, caution is essential in interpreting such sites. Tlingit burial places are not simply archaeological curiosities. They are sacred locations tied to identity, lineage, and cultural continuity. Many remain protected under cultural heritage laws and through community stewardship. Their significance is not diminished by uncertainty. Instead, it is reinforced by the responsibility to approach them with respect and restraint. Anthropological research generally emphasizes that Tlingit mortuary traditions reflect a sophisticated understanding of social structure and environmental adaptation. Clan systems govern not only inheritance and identity, but also responsibilities toward ancestors. Burial practices are therefore deeply embedded within a wider system of relationship, where land, water, and memory are interconnected. Still, questions arise when considering the broader pattern of coastal burial sites across the North Pacific region. Similar traditions of cave interment or concealed burial spaces appear in multiple indigenous cultures along coastal and riverine environments. While each tradition is distinct and culturally specific, the recurrence of sheltered burial locations invites reflection on how geography influences mortuary practice. What conditions lead communities to select caves, cliffs, or hidden spaces as final resting places? Is it primarily environmental protection, spiritual symbolism, or a combination of both? Some speculative interpretations outside academic consensus have suggested that hidden burial caves may reflect ancient population movements along coastal corridors, preserving traces of long-term habitation in areas now difficult to access. Others propose that such sites could be part of broader networks of sacred geography, where certain natural formations are repeatedly chosen for their symbolic significance rather than practical convenience. These ideas remain unverified and are not supported by direct evidence, but they persist in broader discussions of coastal archaeology. What remains clear, however, is that the landscape itself plays an active role in shaping both memory and interpretation. In a region where forests can reclaim clearings within decades, and where tides continually reshape shorelines, the boundary between visible and concealed is always in motion. Standing along the mist-covered coast of southeastern Alaska, it is difficult not to sense this fluidity. The cliffs rise steeply from the water, their surfaces carved by ice and rain over immense spans of time. Forests extend thickly inland, their depth concealing more than they reveal. Somewhere within that layered terrain, burial places may still exist, some known, some protected, and some perhaps obscured by time and natural change. And so the question remains, quiet and unresolved. Are the hidden burial caves of the Tlingit primarily a reflection of environmental transformation and archaeological partial visibility, or do they also preserve deeper layers of cultural geography that modern mapping has yet to fully account for? For now, the coastline continues its slow conversation with the sea, holding within it both what is seen and what remains respectfully unseen. As the narrative leaves behind the mist-covered coastlines of southeastern Alaska, where Tlingit burial caves rest between forest and sea, the journey turns once again inland. The air grows drier, the terrain more open, and the horizon begins to widen into a familiar expanse of high desert and stone. Here, in the heart of the American Southwest, the landscape shifts from vertical cliffs and ocean inlets to mesas, arroyos, and wind-carved plateaus that stretch beneath an endless sky. It is within this region, long home to the Zuni people, that another enduring story emerges, one that speaks not of burial or concealment, but of emergence, origin, and ancestral memory tied to the land itself. Among these traditions is the concept often referred to in English as the cave of the ancestors. To approach this idea requires moving carefully through both geography and meaning. The Zuni Pueblo, located in western New Mexico, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America. Archaeological and historical evidence places its origins within a deep timeline of cultural development in the region, with roots extending back through centuries of migration, settlement, and adaptation to the arid environment of the Colorado Plateau. Within Zuni oral tradition, the world is understood as layered and directional, shaped by emergence narratives that describe movement through multiple worlds before arriving in the present one. These accounts are not framed as distant mythology, but as foundational teachings that connect identity, land, and responsibility. In this framework, certain locations across the landscape are associated with moments of emergence, transformation, or ancestral passage. The Cave of the Ancestors, as it appears in modern retellings, is not a single clearly mapped archaeological site with universally agreed coordinates. Rather, it is a concept that overlaps with multiple places of origin and emergence within Zuni cosmology, locations where ancestors are understood to have entered this world or transitioned between stages of existence. Some of these sites are associated with caves, springs, and subterranean spaces that carry deep ceremonial significance. Archaeologically, the Southwest contains numerous cave sites and sheltered rock formations that were used by ancient Puebloan peoples for habitation, storage, and ritual activity. Evidence from these sites shows long-term human presence, with artifacts ranging from pottery and tools to ceremonial objects. In many cases, caves provided stable environmental conditions in an otherwise harsh climate, offering protection from temperature extremes and seasonal variability. Yet, within Zuni tradition, the significance of caves extends beyond practicality. Certain subterranean or enclosed spaces are understood as spiritually charged environments, where the boundary between physical and ancestral realms is especially thin. These places are often approached with ceremony and caution, reflecting a worldview in which landscape is not inert, but alive with memory and presence. The concept of emergence from the earth is central to this understanding, symbolizing both origin and ongoing relationship with the land. Anthropological interpretations generally frame these narratives as complex systems of ecological knowledge and cultural continuity. Emergence stories are often seen as ways of encoding migration patterns, environmental adaptation, and social organization over long periods of time. In this view, the cave is not necessarily a literal singular location, but a symbolic representation of transition between states of being, between environments, and between historical phases of community development. Still, the persistence of specific place-based references within oral tradition invites deeper reflection. Some researchers have noted that certain emergence-related sites correspond with archaeological locations showing long-term ceremonial use. These include areas with kivas, rock art, and evidence of sustained ritual activity over centuries. While such correspondences do not confirm a singular cave of the ancestors, they do suggest a meaningful relationship between narrative geography and physical landscape. Why do so many emergence traditions across different cultures emphasize movement through the earth, through caves, chambers, or subterranean spaces, into the present world? Is this primarily symbolic language describing psychological or social transformation, or does it reflect ancient environmental experiences encoded into narrative form? These questions remain open within comparative anthropology. Beyond mainstream interpretation, more speculative approaches have occasionally attempted to link emergence narratives across different indigenous traditions, suggesting the possibility of shared archetypal memory or ancient migration frameworks preserved in symbolic geography. Others have proposed that caves and subterranean spaces in oral traditions may preserve memory of geological or climatic transitions experienced over millennia, expressed through metaphor rather than literal description. These ideas remain outside established archaeological consensus and are not supported by direct physical evidence, but they continue to appear in broader discussions of ancient landscape memory. What is consistently emphasized within Zuni cultural understanding, however, is that these places are not simply subjects for external analysis. They are part of a living relationship between people and land, maintained through ceremony, language, and responsibility. The cave is not an artifact. It is a point of connection where origin and presence intersect in ongoing practice. Standing within the broader landscape of western New Mexico, the desert appears deceptively still. Sunlight moves across stone formations with slow precision. Wind carries fine dust through open spaces, reshaping the surface of the land in subtle, continuous ways. In such an environment, permanence feels less like a fixed condition and more like a temporary balance between change and continuity. It is perhaps within this context that the idea of a cave of the ancestors gains its deeper resonance, not as a single hidden chamber waiting to be discovered, but as a network of meaning distributed across landforms, stories, and memory. A geography that is not fully visible on maps, but is continuously present in practice and understanding. And so the question remains, carefully unclosed. Is the cave of the ancestors best understood as a symbolic framework for emergence and identity, as a reflection of ancient human experiences encoded into landscape, or as a form of cultural geography that operates beyond conventional definitions of place? For now, the desert holds its silence, and the stone remains unchanged, while the stories continue to move through it, as they always have, between earth, memory, and the unseen spaces where origin is still remembered. As the narrative settles into the quiet resonance of Zuni emergence traditions, where caves are not hidden relics but living thresholds of memory, the journey shifts once again. The desert begins to widen, the stone formations soften into rolling terrain, and the air carries a different kind of weight. It is less about origin stories carved into landscape, and more about objects, small, enduring, and metallic, left behind in places where they seem, at first glance, almost out of time. Across the Lake Superior Basin, deep within forested stretches of what is now northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, the ground has occasionally yielded something unexpected. Beneath layers of soil, peat, and ancient shoreline deposits, archaeologists and independent researchers have uncovered copper artifacts that continue to raise quiet but persistent questions about the deep timeline of human craftsmanship in North America. These objects are not dramatic in appearance at first. Many are simple, hammered fragments, all like tools, fish hooks, and small ornamental pieces. Yet their material carries a significance that sets them apart. Native copper, found in a relatively pure, workable form in this region, does not require smelting in the way ores do elsewhere in the world. It can be shaped through cold hammering, gradually refined by repeated striking, annealing, and reshaping. What makes these artifacts intriguing is not simply their existence, but their context. Some copper tools and fragments recovered from burial mounds and ancient habitation sites have been associated with cultures that flourished thousands of years ago in the Great Lakes region. Archaeological frameworks generally place much of this activity within what is sometimes referred to as the Old Copper Complex, a long span of pre-contact indigenous copper use that may extend back several millennia before the present era. Radiocarbon dating of associated organic materials suggests that copper working in this region could date as far back as 3000 BC, or earlier in some contexts, though precise timelines remain subject to ongoing refinement and debate. This places copper use in North America within a surprisingly deep historical horizon, one that predates many later, more widely recognized metallurgical traditions elsewhere in the world. Yet even within this established framework, certain details continue to invite closer examination. Some copper artifacts appear in locations far from primary known extraction sites, suggesting extensive trade networks or long-distance movement of materials. Others show repeated cycles of reshaping, as if tools were continuously reused, modified, and passed along over generations. In some cases, artifacts discovered in burial contexts appear intentionally placed, indicating that copper held not only practical value, but also symbolic or ceremonial significance. How did early communities identify and exploit these copper sources with such consistency across vast forested landscapes? What systems of knowledge allowed for the extraction, transport, and distribution of a material that, while naturally abundant in certain regions, still required effort and skill to shape effectively? Mainstream archaeological interpretation offers grounded explanations. The Lake Superior region contains some of the richest native copper deposits on Earth, often exposed along ancient shorelines and glacially scoured rock formations. Over thousands of years, indigenous peoples developed sophisticated methods of collection and cold working, gradually refining techniques through observation, experimentation, and intergenerational knowledge transfer. In this view, what appears unusual in scale is understood as the result of long-term cultural continuity rather than sudden technological emergence. But as with many aspects of deep-time archaeology, certain gaps in the record remain. Organic materials decay. Tools are often reused. Contexts are disturbed by natural processes such as glaciation, erosion, and shifting shorelines. As a result, reconstructing precise sequences of technological development becomes a careful exercise in inference rather than direct observation. Within these interpretive spaces, questions naturally arise, questions that extend beyond established conclusions. Some researchers have noted that the sophistication of certain copper working techniques appears unexpectedly advanced for its early time frame, particularly when compared with other contemporaneous material cultures. This observation has led to discussions about whether copper working in the Great Lakes region developed independently in multiple phases or through a more complex network of cultural exchange than currently understood. Outside mainstream scholarship, more speculative interpretations occasionally emerge. A small number of independent writers and alternative historians have suggested that the scale and distribution of copper artifacts might point to a more organized system of production than typically attributed to pre-contact societies in North America. Others have gone further, proposing hypothetical scenarios involving lost technological traditions or forgotten cycles of metallurgical knowledge that predate established archaeological timelines. These ideas are not supported by physical evidence and remain outside academic consensus, but they continue to circulate in discussions surrounding ancient metallurgy and out-of-place artifacts. It is important, however, to distinguish between curiosity and conclusion. The presence of unusual interpretations does not negate the established record, but rather highlights the areas where the record is incomplete, fragmented, or still under active study. What remains firmly supported by evidence is that indigenous communities of the Great Lakes region possessed deep knowledge of their environment and its resources. Copper was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a broader material culture that included stone tool industries, extensive trade networks, and complex social systems that evolved over long periods of time. The artifacts themselves reflect continuity, adaptation, and sustained interaction with the land. Still, the copper objects carry a quiet tension within them. Unlike stone tools, which are shaped by subtraction, copper is reshaped, softened, and reworked. It holds the memory of repeated transformation. A single fragment may have passed through many hands, each altering its form slightly, each adding another layer of use or meaning. In this sense, the artifact becomes less a static object and more a record of ongoing relationship between material and maker. Standing in the forested regions where some of these discoveries have been made, the landscape offers little immediate indication of the depth of time beneath its surface. Trees grow, fall, and regrow. Rivers shift subtly across centuries. Soil accumulates quietly, layer upon layer, concealing what once lay exposed. It is a landscape that does not announce its history loudly, but instead preserves it in fragments. And so the copper artifacts remain in a space between clarity and uncertainty. Are they evidence of a long, continuous tradition of skilled craftsmanship gradually evolving over thousands of years within known cultural frameworks? Or do they hint at a deeper complexity in early metallurgical knowledge across the continent, one that archaeology is still working to fully map and understand? For now, the copper lies still, shaped by hands long gone, resting beneath soil that continues to shift and settle. The questions it raises do not demand immediate answers. Instead, they remain suspended in time, like the artifacts themselves, waiting for further discovery, further context, and perhaps further understanding of how deeply human history can be written into even the smallest fragments of metal. As the narrative leaves behind the quiet endurance of copper artifacts buried beneath the forests of the Great Lakes, the journey shifts once again into open country. The land begins to rise and flatten in alternating waves, stretching outward into the vast expanse of the northern plains. Here, the horizon is uninterrupted, the sky immense, and the wind carries a constant presence across grassland that seems to breathe with seasonal change. It is within this wide, open geography, spanning parts of present-day Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, that another set of enigmatic structures emerges. From a distance, they are easy to overlook. Low stone formations, often circular or radiating outward in subtle patterns, blend into the natural terrain. Yet upon closer observation, they reveal intentional design, shaped by human hands in ways that suggest both precision and purpose. These are commonly referred to as medicine wheels. At their simplest, medicine wheels are arrangements of stones placed on the ground in circular or radial patterns. Some resemble wagon wheels, with a central cairn and spokes extending outward. Others are more complex, incorporating multiple rings, alignments, or peripheral stone features. They vary in size, from small configurations only a few meters across to expansive structures spanning tens of meters in diameter. Archaeological research confirms that many of these sites were constructed by indigenous peoples of the plains over extended periods, with some dating back several centuries or more before present-day records. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials suggests that certain medicine wheels may have been in use for hundreds, possibly even over 1,000 years, though exact timelines remain difficult to establish due to limited organic material directly connected to their construction. What is consistently evident, however, is that these structures were not random. Many medicine wheels show alignments with astronomical events. Certain stones correspond to the rising or setting positions of the sun during solstices and equinoxes. Others appear to align with the heliacal rising of specific stars or seasonal celestial patterns. In some cases, sightlines between stones suggest deliberate orientation toward distant geographic landmarks or horizon points. This has led researchers to widely interpret medicine wheels as ceremonial and astronomical structures, places where observation of the sky was integrated with cultural and spiritual practice. Within this framework, they are understood as tools for tracking seasonal change, guiding ceremonial timing, and reinforcing relationships between land, sky, and community. Yet even within this interpretation, questions remain. Why does the distribution of medicine wheels extend across such a wide and ecologically diverse region? What allowed different indigenous nations, separated by language, environment, and lifestyle, to develop similar stone arrangements with comparable structural logic? And why do some wheels appear to prioritize astronomical alignment, while others seem more focused on geographic or topographical relationships? The northern plains themselves offer some clues. This is a landscape defined by visibility. Without dense forest or obstructive terrain, the sky dominates perception. Celestial movement becomes highly legible. The sun's arc across the horizon is unobstructed. Seasonal shifts in light and temperature are immediately noticeable. In such an environment, careful long-term observation of celestial cycles would naturally become embedded in cultural practice. From this perspective, medicine wheels can be understood as physical expressions of environmental awareness, built records of time, movement, and seasonal change encoded in stone. They represent a convergence of observation and structure, where landscape becomes a form of calendar and the sky becomes a reference system for life on the ground. Still, not every aspect of these structures is fully understood. Some medicine wheels appear to have no clear astronomical alignment. Others are located in positions that are not immediately practical for settlement or daily activity. Certain configurations suggest layers of modification over time, with stones added, removed, or repositioned across generations. This raises the possibility that medicine wheels were not static constructions, but evolving sites of ongoing cultural significance. In many indigenous traditions of the plains, stone structures are not viewed as inert artifacts. They are part of a living relationship between people and land. Placement of stone can carry meaning tied to ceremony, memory, direction, and responsibility. Within this worldview, the purpose of a medicine wheel may not be singular or fixed, but layered, serving different functions depending on time, context, and community knowledge. Anthropological interpretations generally support this multidimensional understanding. Medicine wheels are often seen as ceremonial landscapes where astronomy, spirituality, and social organization intersect. They may function simultaneously as calendars, teaching tools, and sacred spaces. Rather than serving one definitive purpose, they likely reflect a network of meanings embedded within broader cultural systems. Yet beyond established interpretations, additional questions continue to emerge. Some researchers have noted that certain medicine wheels exhibit alignments that correspond not only to solar and stellar events, but also to more complex geometric relationships between multiple sites across the landscape. This has led to speculation about whether some wheels were part of larger regional systems of knowledge, networks of observation points connected across vast distances. These ideas remain under investigation and are not universally accepted, but they highlight an important feature of medicine wheel studies. The structures often resist singular explanation. Each site must be understood individually, yet also in relation to broader patterns that may or may not be fully visible in the archaeological record. Outside mainstream scholarship, more speculative interpretations occasionally appear. Some independent researchers have proposed that medicine wheels may encode deeper mathematical or navigational knowledge than currently recognized, suggesting that their alignments reflect complex systems of spatial awareness. Others have speculated that certain configurations might preserve information about ancient environmental conditions or migration routes across the plains. These interpretations, while intriguing, remain unsupported by definitive evidence and are not part of established archaeological consensus. What remains firmly grounded in research, however, is the recognition that these structures were created with intention. The placement of stone in precise patterns across open land requires effort, coordination, and sustained cultural knowledge. Whether used for ceremony, observation, teaching, or all of these combined, medicine wheels reflect a long-standing relationship between human communities and the rhythms of the natural world. Standing beside one of these structures today, the silence of the plains becomes especially noticeable. Wind moves steadily across grassland, and the horizon remains unbroken in every direction. The stones lie low against the earth, shaped not to dominate the landscape, but to exist within it. Their presence is subtle, yet deliberate, quiet markers of a worldview that reads meaning in both sky and ground. And so the question remains open, like the circular form of the wheels themselves. Are the hidden medicine wheels of the northern plains primarily astronomical tools, ceremonial landscapes, or multi-purpose knowledge systems that integrated observation, memory, and meaning into a single form? Or do they represent something even more layered, structures whose full significance can only be understood through perspectives that combine archaeology, oral tradition, and lived experience? For now, the stones remain in place, weathered but enduring, aligned with horizons that continue to shift with time. And above them, the sky continues its slow and predictable motion, as it has for countless generations, carrying with it the same unanswered question. What exactly was being recorded here, and how much of that understanding still rests beneath the open wind of the plains? The desert has a way of preserving secrets. Across the high plateaus and rugged canyons of what is now the American Southwest, narrow paths weave through sandstone cliffs, winding across mesas, descending into hidden valleys, and disappearing into the horizon. At first glance, they appear to be little more than weathered trails carved by centuries of footsteps. But viewed from above, a different picture begins to emerge. Some of these ancient routes stretch for astonishing distances, crossing terrain that seems almost impossible to navigate on foot. They connect settlements separated by sheer cliffs, deep ravines, and vast expanses of open desert, with a precision that continues to surprise archaeologists today. These are often called the ancient sky roads of the ancestral Puebloans, a civilization whose remarkable achievements continue to challenge modern assumptions about life in one of North America's harshest environments. For hundreds of years, beginning around the 1st centuries AD and continuing until roughly the late 1200s, the ancestral Puebloans built thriving communities throughout the Four Corners region. They constructed intricate cliff dwellings, multi-story stone villages, ceremonial structures known as kivas, and an extensive network of roads that linked distant settlements across the landscape. Many of these roads are still visible today. Some remain little more than faint lines etched into the desert floor. Others are unmistakable. They measure up to 30 feet wide, remarkably straight, and in certain places are bordered by carefully arranged stone berms. Instead of following the easiest route around obstacles, many cut directly across difficult terrain. They climb steep slopes by means of carved stairways, descend cliff faces using handholds cut into solid rock, and continue onward as though geography itself were only a minor inconvenience. Why build roads this way? That question has lingered for decades. The most widely accepted explanation is practical. Archaeologists believe these routes connected communities that exchanged food, pottery, tools, timber, turquoise, and other valuable resources. The roads would have strengthened trade, communication, and cooperation across a vast region. In a challenging environment where rainfall could vary dramatically from year to year, maintaining relationships between settlements may have been essential for survival. Evidence certainly supports this idea. Excavations have uncovered imported materials that traveled hundreds of miles, demonstrating that extensive trade networks existed. Timber used in major construction projects sometimes originated from mountain forests many miles away, requiring enormous logistical effort. Yet practical explanations alone do not account for every feature. Some roads lead to thriving villages. Others appear to lead nowhere. They extend for miles before ending abruptly at isolated cliffs, empty mesas, or seemingly featureless stretches of desert. Despite extensive archaeological surveys, no permanent settlements have been found at the destinations of several of these routes. Were the communities once there and simply lost to time? Or were these roads intended for something entirely different? One possibility centers on ceremony rather than commerce. Many researchers believe some roads served as sacred pathways used during religious processions. In Pueblo traditions, journeys often carried symbolic meaning, reflecting spiritual migrations, seasonal cycles, or connections between the physical world and the sacred landscape. A road ending at a solitary mesa or prominent rock formation may never have been intended as transportation in the modern sense. Instead, the destination itself could have held ceremonial significance. The landscape, after all, was not simply scenery. It was part of a living spiritual world. Natural landmarks could represent ancestors, sacred beings, or important events remembered through generations of oral tradition. Walking a particular route may have been as meaningful as arriving at its destination. This interpretation helps explain another curious feature. Many of the roads are astonishingly straight. Rather than winding around hills or following streams, they frequently maintain an unwavering direction for remarkable distances. Modern surveyors have noted just how accurately some of these alignments were maintained despite the uneven terrain. How was such precision achieved? Without compasses, aerial views, or modern surveying equipment, maintaining perfectly straight roads over miles of rugged country would have required extraordinary planning and coordination. Some researchers suggest that teams simply established distant visual markers and worked carefully toward them. Others point to generations of accumulated environmental knowledge passed down through experienced builders familiar with every contour of the land. Even so, the consistency remains impressive. Among the most intriguing examples are the roads associated with Chaco Canyon. Between roughly AD 850 and 1150, Chaco Canyon became one of the most sophisticated cultural centers in North America. Massive stone buildings known as great houses rose from the canyon floor, some containing hundreds of rooms arranged with remarkable architectural precision. Roads radiated outward from Chaco in multiple directions, linking it with communities spread across hundreds of miles. Some of these routes measured nearly 30 feet across. Unlike ordinary footpaths formed naturally through repeated travel, they appear deliberately engineered. The scale alone suggests tremendous investment. Constructing such roads required thousands of hours of labor from communities already facing the challenges of farming in an unpredictable desert climate. Every hour spent building roads was an hour not spent gathering food, tending crops, or constructing homes. Why devote such effort? Was Chaco primarily an administrative center directing regional trade? A ceremonial destination visited by pilgrims? A gathering place for seasonal festivals? Or perhaps all of these at once? The evidence supports multiple possibilities, yet no single explanation answers every question. Then there are the astronomical connections. The ancestral Puebloans possessed an extraordinary understanding of the sky. Structures throughout the region align with solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. At places such as Fajada Butte, carefully positioned stones interact with shafts of sunlight to mark significant moments in the solar calendar with remarkable accuracy. Could some roads also reflect celestial observations? A few researchers have explored whether certain alignments correspond with the rising or setting points of important stars, the movements of the sun, or other astronomical events. While some patterns appear suggestive, others caution that proving intentional design is extremely difficult. Human beings naturally recognize patterns, and distinguishing meaningful alignments from coincidence requires careful analysis. Still, the possibility remains fascinating. If these routes connected earth and sky through ritual movement, then every journey may have carried layers of meaning invisible to modern observers. Beyond mainstream archaeology, more speculative theories have naturally emerged. Some independent writers have proposed that the roads formed part of an immense energy network spanning the continent, similar to the concept of ley lines suggested in other parts of the world. According to these ideas, ancient builders intentionally positioned roads and settlements along unseen currents, believed to possess spiritual or natural power. Supporters point to the remarkable straightness of certain routes and the apparent alignment between distant ceremonial sites. Critics argue there is no scientific evidence demonstrating the existence of such energy grids, and that archaeological findings are more consistently explained through cultural, religious, and economic factors. Another theory suggests the roads reflected sophisticated geographic knowledge far beyond what is typically credited to ancient societies. Rather than isolated villages, perhaps the ancestral Puebloans maintained a carefully organized regional landscape connected through planned infrastructure and shared traditions that modern researchers are only beginning to appreciate. This possibility, unlike some of the more extraordinary claims, continues to receive growing attention. Every new survey using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and LiDAR technology reveals additional traces hidden beneath vegetation and desert sands. What once appeared to be isolated settlements increasingly resembles an interconnected world whose complexity is still unfolding. Yet many questions endure. How many roads have vanished beneath centuries of erosion? How many destinations remain undiscovered? And how much meaning has been lost as languages, ceremonies, and traditions changed over generations? The silence of the desert offers few answers. The wind still moves across the mesas, just as it did 1,000 years ago. Ancient stairways remain carved into stone. Narrow paths still trace impossible lines across cliffs and open country. They continue onward, unwavering, toward places whose purpose is not always clear. Perhaps they were simply roads. Perhaps they were something more. And somewhere beyond the next ridge, beneath another layer of sand or hidden within another forgotten canyon, there may still be another piece of the story waiting to be found. As the narrative fades from the ancient sky roads of the ancestral Puebloans, those silent alignments stretched between earth and horizon, the journey turns once again toward stone, but this time into something far more enclosed. The openness of the desert gives way to narrowing passages, where cliffs rise sharply and the land folds into itself. Wind still moves here, but it behaves differently, funneled through fractures in rock, carrying sound rather than dispersing it. In the high country of what is now Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, the ancestral homelands of the Ute people stretch across mountains, plateaus, and deep canyon systems carved over millions of years. It is a landscape defined by elevation and echo, where sound does not simply fade into distance, but returns, reshaped by stone. Within this geography, there are places known in modern retellings as the Whispering Caves of the Ute. The name itself is not a formal archaeological designation, but rather a descriptive label that has emerged from a combination of oral references, regional storytelling, and occasional traveler accounts describing unusual acoustic experiences within certain cave systems and rock shelters. To approach these accounts, it is necessary first to understand the environment in which they occur. The Colorado Plateau and adjacent mountain ranges contain thousands of natural caves, alcoves, and erosion-formed chambers. Many of these spaces were used by indigenous communities across centuries for shelter, storage, ceremonial activity, and seasonal refuge. Archaeological evidence in the broader region confirms long-term human presence in rock shelters, with material remains including tools, pottery fragments, textiles, and petroglyphs etched into stone surfaces. The Ute people, whose historical territory spans much of the central Rocky Mountains, have maintained a deep connection to these landscapes for generations. Their traditions reflect a close relationship with the mountain environment, where geography is not simply backdrop, but active participant in cultural life. Mountains, caves, rivers, and weather patterns are often understood as part of a living system of presence and interaction. Within this context, caves occupy a particularly sensitive space. Certain cave systems are known for their unique acoustic properties. Narrow passageways can amplify sound, while curved stone surfaces can reflect and distort even the faintest noise. In some formations, a whisper spoken at one end of a chamber may travel in unexpected ways, returning as an echo that seems displaced in direction or timing. These are natural acoustic phenomena, well documented in geology and physics, yet still capable of producing striking experiential effects for those inside such spaces. It is within these conditions that accounts of whispering caves emerge. Some descriptions refer to caves where wind passing through narrow openings produces tonal sounds that resemble speech or murmuring voices. Others describe interior chambers where footsteps, dripping water, or distant airflow create layered echoes that seem to overlap, producing the impression of presence beyond the immediate environment. In rare cases, travelers and explorers have reported hearing what they interpret as faint voices carried through stone corridors, though such experiences are highly subjective and often influenced by environmental factors such as fatigue, darkness, and expectation. From a scientific standpoint, these phenomena can be explained through a combination of acoustic resonance, airflow dynamics, and sensory perception under low-light conditions. Cave systems can act as natural resonating chambers, amplifying specific frequencies while suppressing others. Subtle shifts in air pressure can generate sounds that vary depending on position within the cave. The human brain, when deprived of visual reference points and exposed to ambiguous auditory stimuli, often attempts to interpret patterns in sound, sometimes attributing structure or meaning where none is intentionally present. Yet the persistence of such accounts across different locations and time periods invites closer attention, not necessarily as evidence of the unexplained, but as a reflection of how environments shape perception. Within Ute oral traditions, caves and mountain spaces are often associated with presence, transition, and communication with the natural world. While interpretations vary across communities and contexts, there is a consistent emphasis on respect for certain places that are considered spiritually or culturally significant. In such frameworks, sound itself can carry meaning beyond its physical origin, not as literal speech from unseen sources, but as part of a broader relational understanding of environment. Anthropological studies of indigenous knowledge systems in the Rocky Mountain region emphasize that perception is often integrated with landscape awareness. Wind, animal movement, water flow, and geological acoustics are not isolated sensory inputs, but part of a continuous environmental dialogue. Within this perspective, what modern observers might describe as whispering could be understood as the interpretive experience of listening to a highly responsive acoustic environment. Still, not all accounts are easily categorized. Some explorers and hikers have described caves where sound behaves in ways that feel inconsistent with expectation, where echoes seem delayed, or where directional cues become difficult to locate. Others report sensations of disorientation within certain chambers, where spatial awareness becomes subtly distorted due to uniformity of rock surfaces and limited light. These experiences, while explainable through environmental psychology and cave acoustics, nonetheless contribute to the sense that these spaces are somehow active in perception. There are also more speculative interpretations that circulate outside formal academic research. Some independent writers suggest that recurring reports of unusual auditory experiences in caves across different indigenous territories may point to shared cultural memory encoded in environmental storytelling. Others propose that certain cave systems might naturally produce complex acoustic patterns that, under specific conditions, could be misinterpreted as structured sound. These ideas remain speculative and are not supported by direct evidence indicating intentional or anomalous sound production beyond natural physical processes. It is important, however, not to separate interpretation from environment. Caves are inherently immersive spaces. They remove external visual cues, isolate sound, and compress spatial awareness. Inside them, even familiar noises can feel unfamiliar. A single drop of water can echo for seconds. A distant breeze can move through rock fissures like a shifting presence. The human nervous system, adapted for open environments, responds differently when enclosed by stone on all sides. Standing within such a space, it becomes clear how easily perception and environment can merge. A whisper in a cave is not just a sound, it is a collision between airflow, stone, and human expectation. It exists simultaneously as physical vibration and as interpreted meaning. And in that overlap, ambiguity naturally arises. For the Ute people, whose historical and cultural relationship with mountain landscapes spans generations, caves are not merely geological formations. They are part of a living geography in which movement, sound, and memory are interconnected. While modern interpretations may focus on acoustics or environmental psychology, traditional perspectives often emphasize respect for place and awareness of presence within it. And so the question remains, quiet and unresolved, like sound fading into stone. Are the whispering caves of the Ute best understood as natural acoustic environments whose properties shape human perception in unusual ways, or do they reflect deeper cultural relationships with landscape that integrate sound, memory, and meaning into a single experiential framework? Or, perhaps more subtly, do they remind us that in certain places, the boundary between hearing and interpretation is thinner than we assume? For now, the caves remain as they have always been, dark, enclosed, and responsive to even the smallest movement of air. And within them, sound continues to travel through stone, changing shape as it moves, returning not as certainty, but as echo. As the shifting imagery of the Great Basin petroglyph fields fades into the heat and silence of the desert, the narrative turns once again toward water and stone, toward the northern edge of the continent where the land breaks into vast freshwater horizons. The air grows heavier, cooler, and more humid. Forest returns in dense layers, and between the trees, light reflects off immense bodies of water that seem less like lakes and more like inland seas. This is the homeland of the Ojibwe people, whose ancestral territories span the Great Lakes region, an environment shaped by water in constant motion, wind that travels unbroken across open expanse, and rock formations that predate human memory. It is here, along rugged shorelines and ancient rock outcrops, that stories persist of what are often called the sacred singing rocks. The phrase does not refer to a single confirmed archaeological site, nor to one standardized location on a map. Instead, it emerges from a combination of oral tradition, regional accounts, and descriptive observations tied to specific natural formations where stone, water, and wind interact in unusual acoustic ways. To understand these accounts, one must first understand the geological foundation of the region itself. The Great Lakes Basin rests upon the Canadian Shield, one of the oldest exposed geological formations on Earth. Composed primarily of granite, basalt, and other dense crystalline rocks, this landscape has been shaped by billions of years of tectonic activity and, more recently, by repeated glacial cycles. As glaciers advanced and retreated, they carved deep basins, smoothed cliff faces, and left behind fractured stone structures exposed to wind and water erosion. This geology matters because it creates conditions where sound behaves in unexpected ways. When wind moves through narrow fissures in rock, it can generate tonal vibrations. When waves strike uneven cliff faces, they can produce rhythmic echoes that vary depending on water level and force. Even subtle temperature shifts can cause stone to expand or contract slightly, altering how sound travels across its surface. In certain configurations, these interactions can create resonant frequencies that resemble sustained tones. From a scientific standpoint, these are well understood acoustic phenomena. Yet within Ojibwe oral traditions, sound is not interpreted solely as mechanical vibration. In many indigenous worldviews of the Great Lakes region, the natural environment is understood as interconnected and responsive. Water, wind, rock, and living beings are part of a continuous relational system in which perception is shaped through interaction rather than separation. Within this framework, sound is not simply something that occurs in the environment, it is part of the environment's expression. The idea of singing rocks, then, is not necessarily a claim about supernatural sound production, but a way of describing places where environmental acoustics are especially noticeable, meaningful, or responsive to human presence. Some accounts describe locations where wind passing over stone produces tones that seem to shift in pitch depending on movement or direction. Others describe shoreline formations where waves striking rock create layered echoes that feel almost rhythmic, as if following an underlying pattern. In rare cases, observers have reported hearing faint tonal sequences that resemble melodic structures, though such experiences are highly subjective and dependent on environmental conditions. From a geological perspective, these effects are consistent with natural resonance in complex rock formations. Still, the persistence of such descriptions across different locations invites closer attention, not as anomalies outside of nature, but as examples of how humans interpret sound within immersive environments. Anthropological research into Ojibwe traditions emphasizes the importance of listening as a form of awareness. In this context, sound is not merely auditory input, but part of a broader engagement with place. The rustle of trees, the movement of water, the shifting of ice across lake surfaces, all are elements of a living soundscape that carries information about seasonal change, weather patterns, and environmental relationships. Within such a worldview, locations where sound behaves in distinctive ways may be regarded with particular attention, not because they are mysterious in a supernatural sense, but because they highlight the responsiveness of the natural world. The concept of singing rocks can therefore be understood as part of a descriptive language that acknowledges these heightened acoustic interactions. However, as with many natural phenomena that exist at the intersection of science and perception, interpretation varies. Mainstream geological explanations account for most observed acoustic effects through resonance, wind flow, wave dynamics, and material composition. These explanations are supported by measurable physical principles and can be replicated under controlled conditions in similar environments. At the same time, field observations occasionally reveal subtle variations that depend heavily on timing, weather, and location. A rock formation that produces a distinct tone under one set of conditions may fall silent under another. A shoreline that seems acoustically active during wind may become completely quiet when the air stills. This variability contributes to the sense that these places are not fixed in their auditory expression, but responsive to environmental change. Some researchers in environmental acoustics have suggested that such variability is typical of complex natural systems, where multiple variables interact to produce shifting sensory outcomes. In this view, there is no need to invoke extraordinary explanations. The complexity itself is sufficient. Yet interpretive frameworks are not limited to physical explanation alone. Within cultural storytelling traditions, especially those rooted in long-term observation of place, sound often carries associative meaning. A particular tone may be remembered not just as an acoustic event, but as part of a broader environmental narrative tied to season, memory, or experience. In this sense, the singing of rocks may function as a way of encoding attention to subtle environmental cues that modern analytical frameworks might separate into distinct categories. There are also more speculative interpretations that occasionally appear in broader discussions of acoustic phenomena in natural environments. Some independent researchers have proposed that certain rock formations, due to their mineral composition and structural geometry, might be capable of sustaining rare resonant effects under specific environmental conditions. Others suggest that human perception in immersive natural settings may integrate multiple overlapping sound sources into cohesive auditory patterns that feel structured or intentional. These ideas remain outside established consensus, but reflect ongoing curiosity about the boundaries of environmental perception. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the recognition that these are deeply immersive environments. Standing along the rocky shorelines of the Great Lakes, sound is never entirely absent. Even in apparent silence, there is movement. Water against stone, wind across surface, distant echoes carried through forested space. In such conditions, hearing becomes an act of interpretation as much as perception. A faint tone may be just wind passing through stone, or it may be the mind assembling fragmented sound into coherence. Or perhaps more simply, it may be the natural world revealing the subtle complexity of its own structure. And so the question remains open, suspended like sound over water. Are the sacred singing rocks of the Ojibwe best understood purely through geological acoustics, as culturally meaningful points of environmental attention, or as places where the complexity of natural sound invites interpretations that extend beyond simple categorization? For now, the lakes continue their steady motion, and the rocks remain where they have always been, silent in appearance, yet never entirely without voice, depending on how the wind chooses to pass through them. As the vision of the effigy mounds fades into the quiet contours of the upper Midwest, where animal forms still rise faintly from the earth beneath grass and thyme, the narrative moves into something less visible, less grounded in landscape, and more closely tied to memory itself. The setting shifts again, not to a single geography, but to a broader cultural horizon across the plains, the woodlands, and the river corridors where many indigenous nations carried objects that were never meant to be seen casually, and often not meant to be seen at all. Among these were what have come to be known in modern descriptions as medicine bundles. To speak of them is to approach something deeply sensitive, because medicine bundles were never simply objects in the ordinary sense. They were carefully prepared, highly personal, and spiritually significant assemblages of items, wrapped, concealed, and protected within layers of material such as animal hide, cloth, or woven fibers. Their contents varied widely depending on nation, ceremony, and individual responsibility, but they often included items such as herbs, stones, feathers, carved pieces, or small symbolic tools. In many traditions, these bundles were not merely possessions. They were considered living repositories of relationship, links between individuals, communities, ancestral knowledge, and the spiritual dimensions of the world. They were also guarded closely. Historically, medicine bundles were often entrusted to specific individuals or keepers within a community. Their handling followed strict protocols, sometimes requiring ceremonial preparation before they could even be opened or moved. In many cases, they were passed down through generations, maintaining continuity of knowledge and responsibility across time. And yet, in the historical record, there are moments where their presence becomes unexpectedly unclear. During periods of upheaval in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when indigenous communities across North America experienced forced relocation, cultural suppression, and disruption of traditional lifeways, many sacred items were displaced. Some were taken, others hidden, and others entrusted to individuals or locations in ways that were not always recorded in written form. It is within this historical context that references to vanishing medicine bundles emerge. Unlike archaeological artifacts recovered from controlled excavation sites, medicine bundles were not designed for permanence in the public record. Their purpose was not preservation in museums or documentation in archives, but continuity within living tradition. As a result, when they disappeared from visibility, whether through concealment, loss, or intentional protection, their absence often left no trace beyond oral memory. From an archaeological standpoint, this creates a profound challenge. Physical evidence of medicine bundles is extremely rare, largely because of their materials and their cultural handling. Organic components degrade over time, and the bundles themselves were often kept in conditions that prioritized spiritual integrity over environmental preservation. In many cases, knowledge of their contents and locations exists primarily within oral tradition, ceremonial knowledge, or restricted cultural contexts not shared publicly. This means that when modern discussions refer to secret medicine bundles that vanished, they are often describing a gap in external visibility rather than a literal disappearance from cultural existence. But gaps in visibility often generate questions. Where did these bundles go during periods of forced relocation and cultural disruption? Were they hidden intentionally in landscapes, buried in earth, placed within caves, or entrusted to specific sites known only to designated knowledge keepers? Or were some carried across long distances, maintaining continuity in ways that left little external trace? Historical accounts from the 19th century suggest a wide range of protective responses by indigenous communities facing increasing external pressure. Sacred items were sometimes concealed to prevent confiscation or desecration. In other cases, they were distributed among trusted individuals or relocated to remote areas. These actions were not random, but carefully considered within the context of cultural survival. From this perspective, the vanishing of medicine bundles is not necessarily a disappearance in the absolute sense, but a transition from visible cultural objects to protected or hidden ones, removed from external view but not from cultural continuity. Anthropological research emphasizes that medicine bundles cannot be fully understood outside their ceremonial frameworks. Their significance is not contained in their physical components alone, but in the relationships, songs, teachings, and responsibilities that surround them. Without this context, any interpretation of their loss becomes incomplete. Still, the absence of visible bundles in the archaeological record has led to broader speculation in some circles. Certain independent writers have suggested that undiscovered medicine bundles may still exist in remote locations, preserved in sealed environments such as caves or protected burial contexts. Others propose that some may have been deliberately relocated multiple times across generations, making their physical tracking nearly impossible without internal cultural knowledge. These ideas remain speculative and are not supported by verifiable archaeological discovery, but they reflect ongoing curiosity about how sacred material culture is preserved outside formal documentation systems. More cautious academic perspectives frame the issue differently. Rather than focusing on lost objects, they emphasize the resilience of knowledge systems themselves. In this view, even when physical items are no longer externally visible, the knowledge associated with them may continue to exist within ceremonial practice, oral transmission, and community stewardship. This distinction is crucial, because what appears as disappearance from an external viewpoint may, within cultural context, represent continuity in another form entirely. The question then shifts, not where the bundles are physically located, but how their meaning is maintained, transformed, or protected across time. In landscapes where many of these traditions originated, physical geography often plays a role in cultural practice. Remote valleys, river bends, and sheltered rock formations have historically served as places of privacy, ceremony, and reflection. It is not difficult to imagine how such environments could support the safeguarding of sacred items when necessary. But whether any specific locations still contain undiscovered bundles is not something the archaeological record can confirm. And perhaps it is not meant to. Standing within these regions today, Whether on the open plains, within forested river valleys, or near the edges of canyon systems, the land itself offers little indication of what may or may not be hidden within it. Stone, soil, and vegetation blend into continuity. Time does not announce what it conceals, and so the idea of secret medicine bundles that vanished remains suspended between history and interpretation. Are they lost objects awaiting discovery in remote and protected landscapes, preserved beyond external reach? Or are they part of a living cultural continuum where disappearance is only apparent from outside observation, while continuity persists within knowledge systems not always visible to the outside world? For now, the answer does not settle into certainty. The land remains quiet. The forests, rivers, and plains continue their slow cycles of change. And somewhere within that continuity, whether in memory, tradition, or physical concealment, the meaning of these bundles persists, not as something fully found or fully lost, but as something held carefully within the space between visibility and protection. As the memory of the vanished medicine bundles settles into quiet abstraction, objects no longer defined by place but by absence itself, the narrative drifts westward once more. The land opens again into vast basins and arid plateaus, where the horizon feels close enough to touch, yet distant enough to dissolve into heat and stone. Here, across the Great Basin and surrounding desert regions, another kind of mystery emerges. Not hidden in caves or wrapped in ceremonial bundles, but etched directly into rock, exposed to wind, sun, and time itself. These are the so-called ghost petroglyph fields. The term is not a formal archaeological classification, but a descriptive phrase used in some modern discussions to refer to clusters of rock carvings that appear unusually dense, stylistically varied, or difficult to interpret within established cultural frameworks. Found across parts of Nevada, Utah, Eastern California, and the broader desert Southwest, these petroglyph sites represent thousands of years of human interaction with stone surfaces. To understand them properly, it is essential to begin with what is known. Petroglyphs are created by removing the darkened surface layer of rock, often called desert varnish, to reveal lighter stone beneath. Over time, this exposed contrast forms images that can persist for centuries or even millennia. Across the Great Basin, these carvings include abstract geometric patterns, animal figures, human-like forms, tracks, spirals, and symbolic shapes whose meanings are still actively studied. Archaeological research confirms that many of these sites were created by multiple cultural groups over extended periods. Different stylistic traditions overlap in the same locations, suggesting that certain rock faces were repeatedly visited, reused, and added to across generations. This creates layered visual records, stone surfaces functioning almost like cumulative archives of human presence. Yet it is precisely this layering that gives rise to uncertainty. In some locations, petroglyph panels contain markings that do not easily align with known stylistic categories. Figures appear elongated, fragmented, or arranged in sequences that resist straightforward interpretation. In other cases, carvings are positioned in ways that suggest visual framing from specific vantage points, as if intended to be viewed under particular lighting conditions or seasonal angles. Why certain rock faces were selected over others remains an open question. The geology of the Great Basin offers partial explanation. Smooth, dark, varnished surfaces are ideal for engraving, and naturally sheltered rock walls provide long-term preservation. But selection alone does not fully account for the complexity or repetition found at certain sites. Some panels appear to have been revisited across centuries, with new carvings placed alongside older ones in ways that respect, obscure, or transform earlier imagery. This suggests that these rock surfaces were not static displays, but evolving cultural spaces. Mainstream archaeological interpretation frames petroglyph fields as expressions of communication, territorial marking, spiritual practice, and storytelling. In this view, the carvings represent a wide range of meanings depending on time, group, and context. Some images may record hunting knowledge, migration routes, or environmental observations. Others may reflect ceremonial activity or mythological narratives embedded in landscape. However, interpretation becomes more complex when considering the sheer density of certain sites. At some locations, carvings cover nearly every available surface, layered upon one another in patterns that make chronological sequencing difficult. In these cases, the rock face becomes less like a single narrative and more like a continuous accumulation of meaning, an ongoing dialogue between human presence and geological surface. This raises an important question. Were these sites intended to be read as fixed messages, or as living surfaces continuously rewritten over time? Within indigenous knowledge systems of the broader region, rock art is often understood not simply as representation, but as relationship. Images are not only depictions of things, but active participants in a network of meaning that includes land, memory, and presence. In this sense, a petroglyph is not just a mark on stone, it is part of an ongoing interaction between people and place. Some traditions emphasize that certain locations hold particular significance, where the boundary between physical and spiritual perception becomes more fluid. While these interpretations vary widely across communities and are not uniform, they reflect a broader understanding of landscape as responsive rather than inert. From a geological standpoint, the ghost quality attributed to some petroglyph fields can be explained through natural processes of fading, erosion, and partial visibility. Desert varnish regenerates slowly, meaning older carvings can darken or become partially obscured over time. Wind erosion, mineral deposition, and biological growth such as lichen can further alter visibility. As a result, some images appear to emerge or recede depending on light, moisture, and angle of observation. This dynamic visibility contributes to the sense that the imagery is not fixed. A carving visible at dawn may appear almost absent by midday. Shadows can redefine lines that were previously unnoticed. Seasonal changes can alter contrast enough that entire sequences seem to shift in clarity across the year. In this way, perception itself becomes part of interpretation. Still, not all aspects of these sites are easily explained through environmental conditions alone. Some researchers have noted that certain petroglyph panels appear to encode spatial relationships between multiple symbols in ways that suggest structured composition beyond simple placement. Others have pointed out recurring motifs across distant sites that may indicate shared symbolic systems or long-distance cultural communication networks. These observations remain under study and are interpreted cautiously within academic frameworks. More speculative interpretations occasionally extend further. Some independent writers have proposed that certain rock art sites may function as mnemonic landscapes, systems designed to preserve complex knowledge through spatial arrangement rather than written language. Others suggest that overlapping imagery could represent layered storytelling traditions, where multiple narratives coexist within the same physical space, accessible depending on cultural context or interpretive framework. These ideas, while intriguing, remain outside established consensus and are not confirmed by direct evidence. What remains consistent across interpretations, however, is the recognition that these sites were significant over long periods of time. The repeated use of the same rock surfaces implies continuity of attention, an ongoing relationship between people and place that extends beyond a single generation or cultural moment. Whether used for teaching, ceremony, memory, or communication, these panels reflect sustained engagement with landscape as a medium of meaning. Standing before one of these rock faces today, the experience is often quiet. The desert does not emphasize its histories. It holds them in layers of stone, dust, and light. At certain angles, carvings emerge clearly. At others, they nearly vanish. The boundary between visible and hidden becomes unstable, shifting with time and perception. And so the question remains suspended in that shifting visibility. Are the ghost petroglyph fields of the Great Basin primarily records of communication, ceremonial landscapes, or cumulative cultural archives that evolved continuously over centuries? Or do they represent something more complex? Systems of meaning in which image, place, and time were never separated into distinct categories, but existed as a single unfolding surface. For now, the stone remains unchanged in form, yet constantly changing in appearance. And the desert continues its slow work of revealing and concealing, as if the answers themselves were written not in the images alone, but in the shifting light that falls across them.